There it is.
Okay, everybody, good. So you might remember that last time, rather quickly, we looked at the situation of the 2.5 tribes that decided that they did not want to go into or dwell in, live in, within what would be the borders of the promised land. Because they had fought this battle against Edom, and had won, and they had some nice pasture land there. They said, well, things are good for us. Let us just settle here. Moses became incensed, and he said, your brothers, the rest of Israel, are going to go fight, and you're going to stay here enjoying yourselves. And they say, no, we will go. In fact, we will be chalutzim. We will be the vanguard, and we will therefore take the early brunt of the battle. And only when the land is conquered will we return here where we have already settled our flocks and our families. So we see this as kind of the last preparation for entering the promised land. The people are assembled, they're getting ready to go in. There is this question as to whether or not these 2.5 tribes will go. That question is resolved. The entire Israelite people is now ready to enter the promised land. And that is where we find ourselves as we begin the next chapter. So again, we're looking at chapter 33. And what we get here is a list. You remember that we began the book of Numbers with a list, which was a census. And we went tribe by tribe within the people of Israel and listed how many people were in each clan and each tribe. And it had a kind of repetitive feel to it. And now we're coming to the end of the book of Numbers, and we get another list, right, which gives us also, as you'll see in a minute, a very repetitive feel, right? And so if we look at the book of Numbers as a whole, we see a certain structure to it. The beginning of the book really finds them at the beginning of the wilderness journey. And the end of the book here now brings them to the conclusion of the wilderness journey. And we get this sort of summary statement. And the other thing I would mention is that other biblical books seem to have some lists at the end of them as well. So this seems to be, I think I mentioned this to you once before. It's almost like an appendix that we would put, if we were writing a book, we might attach an appendix. And this seems to be something like that, although the story will not be over here. We'll get a little bit more legal information, but we begin reading, Ela Maseh B'nai Yisrael Asher Yatsu Mitzrayim. These are the travels or the marches of the Israelites who left Egypt. And how did they go? Litzva'otam, according to the word svatam comes from sava, right? Troops. The word for the army in Israel today is from this same root, right? The Israeli army is called, the Hebrew word is savah. Okay, so, and they are in the charge of Moses and Aaron, and Moses recorded the starting points of their various marches as directed by the Lord. Now, as directed by the Lord is itself somewhat ambiguous, right? In other words, it could be that God directed Moses to make the following list. Right? And Moses wrote it down at the direction of the Lord. Or it could be that these marches moving from place to place were at the direction of the Lord, and that Moses simply inscribed them on his own volition. So the latter is perhaps, I don't know, the more, I don't know how to, the more logical, right? That why would God tell Moses to write this down rather than just saying that Moses, for posterity, now wants to make a list of the various ways, the various places that the Israelites stopped. The Midrash picks up on this and wants to read it as being at God's direction, that God wants to remind the people of this journey, stage by stage, points of rebellion against God in part. There is this kind of paradoxical way in which the Israelites think of their journey through the wilderness. At times, God sees it as a series of rebellions, and indeed, as we've read it, we've seen that. And yet there is a sense that this is a period of particular closeness to God. God is, as it were, among the people. God is leading them from place to place. The tabernacle is right in the midst of the camp. And so you get Jeremiah, the prophet, later on as seeing this like a bride and a bridegroom together in the wilderness, this kind of idealized sense of quote, closeness. But if that's the case, it's still a very rocky, rocky relationship. At any rate, whether it's directed by God or it is of Moses's volition, we get this written list, right? And I think that's the idea of recording. Vayichtov, God, Moses wrote. And now we get this list. Yisume Ramsuf, they left Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the month. It was on the morrow of the Passover offering that Israelites started out. And now we get just this minimal description. Biyad Ramah, right? Has it translated here defiantly, with an upper hand in the sight of all the Egyptians, right? So the sense here is they're not just runaway slaves. They leave, everybody sees them leaving. And of course, in the book of Exodus, the Egyptians are eager for them to leave, given all the plagues. They were at that time bearing those among them who the Lord had struck down, every firstborn, whereby the Lord executed judgment on their gods. This too is a little ambiguous. The question is how to read what is in Hebrew just the letter Vav, right? So it says the Egyptians were burying the ones who God had struck, all of their firstborn. And then it says the and, or perhaps whereby, the letter Vav can be translated, given its context, in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it means and, sometimes it means but, and sometimes it can mean whereby. So the question here is rather, we're saying God struck down every firstborn and God executed judgment on their gods, or whether it is by striking down the firstborn, God executed judgment on their gods, right? I think the emphasis of reading it as and is to see each plague as an attack on a specific god of ancient Israel, right? So that it starts with blood, which is, the blood, the Nile being turned into blood, which was, of course, the Egyptians worship the Nile. Towards the end, we get the plague of darkness, in which the sun god is covered. And finally, the plague of the firstborn, as Pharaoh, firstborn of his father, and that was the line of the pharaohs, is also considered to be a god. At any rate, now we're going to get the march. And let me just read you a little bit of it in Hebrew, because I want you to get the flavor of the language. V'yisu misukot v'yachanu be'etam asher biksei hamidbar. V'yisu me'etam v'yashuv al pi hachirot asher al pnei bal tzafon v'yanahu lifnei migdal. V'yisu mipnei chirot mipnei chirot v'yavru b'toch hayam hamidbara. And it becomes, let me go a little bit further down where it's even clearer. V'yishu me'elam v'yachanu al yamsuf. V'yishu me'yamsuf v'yachanu b'midbar sin. V'yishu b'midbar sin v'yachanu b'rafka. V'yishu v'yishu v'chanu just that. V'yachanu, v'yisu v'yachanu, v'yisu v'yachanu, v'yisu v'yachanu. Right? You get this very repetitive cadence in the Hebrew. You get this sense of the march. It almost sounds like the march, right? As they go from station to station and place to place. There are a total here of really quite a few different stops, and until they finally get to Arvot Moav, right, the steps of Moav. There are, if you Rashi points out that, leaving aside the first and the last year, there are only 20 stations. And so this is not and that's over 40 years, right? So this is not something, even though it's listed this way, where they're constantly on the march. They're moving from one oasis to another oasis, and they're staying there, one assumes, we don't get an exact amount of time, but they're staying there for quite a while, right? So this is not rapid. And it makes a certain amount of sense. It takes a while to encamp, and it takes a while, once you're encamped, to take the camp down, to move on, and so on. And so you can imagine that people are living for a while in each place. My son-in-law and two of my grandchildren went camping a couple of weeks ago for one night. I said to him, really, one night? By the time you set up, right, it takes an hour to set up, and then you get up the next day and you take it down, right? I don't know why you'd go camping for one night, but my grandchildren were very happy with this. At any rate, what we have here is not that. What we have here is the Israelites settling for really a prolonged period of time. So we're going to pick up, there's no point in just reading this long list, except to point out that it's here. I am going to go now to the galley view, just to see if anyone has a comment or a question on this sort of recapitulation of the march. I would point out that not every place that's mentioned here has been mentioned elsewhere in the Torah. There's some new names here. Most of it we've seen before, but the Torah doesn't tell us everything that happens. It tells us about significant events, And so it's not surprising, actually, that we would see the march this way. Any questions or comments before we go on? Okay, let me go back.
Wait, Anna,
I'm sorry? Yeah, Hannah.
Yeah. I was kind of struck by the fact that he was requested to keep track and write. Does that means there was some kind of stone that had to be carried with him everywhere?
Yeah,
It's
I
hard
guess
to
that's
imagine what that was.
right. So the question, I mean, there are two questions here, right? One is, how are they writing, right? It's not necessarily the case that what they're writing is written on stone. We get a command specifically when there are a couple of places where Moses is told to set up stones or to write on stones. We see that with the tablets. And we're told specifically they're tablets that Moses brings down. When they come to the promised land, which we'll see in Deuteronomy, Moses is supposed to create certain, I guess you could call them signposts at the entrance to the land, and they have writing inscribed on them. But I don't know, but I literally don't know if in this case, what we're talking about is incising something on stone, because as you point out, it has to be carried, right? We know about the tablets that they're put in the ark and they're carried. So remember that they do come out of Egypt, and Egyptians write on papyri, right? Did they take some with them? Well, who knows really how this is done? How long will this last, right? Where will it be kept? It's unclear, but it's striking that it's supposed to be written. It's not oral, right? We do know that lots of traditions in ancient times are memorized and passed down from generation to generation. In fact, much of the Talmud, we're told, at least the Mishnah, the early part of the Talmud, the earliest layer, if you will, was completely oral. It was known as the oral law. It was repeated orally from generation to generation. It was memorized by people who were known as the Tanaim or the Tana. The Tana was the official memorizer. When the rabbis would sit and discuss something in the Mishnah, the Tana was asked to recite it. And once they heard it, then they would discuss it and talk about it. And then their discussions too become a part of this oral tradition. Parenthetically, I might mention that there was a general rule about these memorizers. It was important that they not be very intelligent, right? Why would that be? Because if they were intelligent, they might interpose some thought of their own, right? Because logically, they would expect the next word to be this or that. I would also add to that we see a little bit of this today. It's a little dangerous to have a Torah reader who really understands every word that he or she is reading. Why? I've stood with Torah readers, and sometimes the problem is they add a word because they feel like they know what's coming next. And in terms of Hebrew grammar and syntax, there are words you would expect, right? Better not to know, or at least to be very careful word by word. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're supposed to use a yad, right? A pointer. So we move from word to word, and we're not tempted inadvertently to add something. But this is not memorized. It's very clear. V'yiktov means to write. And Moses writes it down. And this, therefore, is a list for posterity. They will remember this journey, even though, you know, the generations which follow will never have made this trip. There's a kind of interesting parallel to this in the story of Joseph. So you may remember, you know, Joseph and his brothers go to bury their father, Jacob, They're given permission by the Pharaoh to take him back to the land of Canaan, where he comes from, and Jacob is buried in the cave of the Machpelah, where his parents were buried, and where Leah was also buried. Rebecca wasn't buried there because she died on the journey, but otherwise the family is interned there. He gets permission, and on the way, he seems to have stopped, at least according to the Midrash, at the place where his brothers threw him into the pit.
And I checked you when I
Right.
got up.
So the Midrash looks at this or creates this scene because they're interested in the following question. After Joseph's father dies, they go to him, the brothers, and they say, "Our father said you should not, take revenge on us for what we did to you. And this doesn't seem plausible. It doesn't seem like this really happened, but an argument that they're making because they're afraid that Joseph will take retribution. Joseph is actually, according to the Midrash, stopping at the pit to give thanksgiving to God that he survived. That even though he was thrown in there and expected to die, in fact, he survives. He becomes a great man in Egypt and so on. And so he's marking this place. And perhaps this list is something like that as well, that they can remember these various places and what God did for them, right? Or perhaps the way they rebelled and God forgave them. Okay, any other questions on the list before we go on? Okay, so we're going to pick up now with verse 50. We're on page 957. Let me just go back to the speaker view for a minute. Okay, and then in the steppes of Moab, at the Jordan, near Jericho, right? So they're really about to go in. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. You will destroy all their figured objects. You shall destroy all their molten images. You shall demolish all their cult places, all the bamot, these high places on which they offered sacrifices."
Right now. Just takes me a few
So
seconds.
a couple of things about this, and I do hear someone talking, so if you could mute yourself if you were saying anything, otherwise I'll go back and mute everybody, but hopefully that won't be necessary. Okay, so God is not telling them here that they have to kill every Canaanite, right? The language here is v'chorishtem. You should dispossess them. In other words, the language says exile them, force them out of the land, not you have to, commit genocide, kill every single one of them. And in fact, if we look at the book of Joshua, which recounts the battles against the Canaanites, the story, for example, of Jericho and the walls of Jericho and so on, we do not see that they are dispossessed. There are Canaanite strongholds. When David later on, quite a bit later, wants to establish Jerusalem as the capital, he first has to conquer it. So the Canaanites do remain. They may be dispossessed, but they come back. Not all of them are dispossessed. And there's no indication at all that every one of them is executed. So the other thing that they're told here to do is to destroy any evidence of Canaanite ritual or worship. and we'll see why in a minute, though we've seen it before, you should take possession of the land and settle it, right? I have assigned the land to you to possess. Right? Take this land now because I gave it to you. This reminds me a little of a Rashi, very famous Rashi, in which he asks the question all the way back in Genesis, at the beginning of Genesis, why does the Torah begin with the creation of the world? Why doesn't it start with the Exodus? Why do we need those stories about God creating the world, in 7 days and so on? Why? Because there are no commandments there. If the Torah is really a book of laws and commandments, which Rashi is not arguing exactly, but it's a particular point of view. So why do we need the stories in Genesis at all? And specifically, why do we need the story of creation? To tell us, Rashi says, and he quotes a Talmudic figure, Rabbi Yitzhak, and he says to tell us that when the nations of the world say, you stole this land, the answer is God created the world and God has the right to assign lands to whomever God wishes to assign them. And this land has been assigned to the Jewish people. So what's interesting about Rashi's Midrash, by the way, is that he feels the need to say it, and that Rabbi Yitzhak, who is living, almost 1,000 years before Rashi, also has the need to say it. In other words, Jews have for thousands of years felt the need to defend their right to the land of Israel. And one argument that is made today, largely by people on the far right, the Haredim, those who accept Israel, as well as people we would call modern Orthodox, is this is our land because God gave it to us.
And why we do accept it?
Simple as that. The argument that we see in that first Rashi, though there are many other arguments that people make, and secular ones, things having to do with the long-term attachment of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and so on, that we were the indigenous people of the land. At any rate, God says, you should take possession of the land and settle it. I've assigned the land to you. You should apportion the land among yourselves by lot, clan by clan. With larger groups, increase the share. With smaller groups, reduce the share. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, that will be his. You shall have your portions according to their tribes. In other words, the land will be divided up, and the tribe will, these are, the tribes who are the descendants of the sons of Jacob. These tribes have their specific areas in the land, and then there's a lottery in terms of the families within the tribe, the heads of family, the clans, right? And through this lottery, they will be assigned their holdings in the land of Israel. The bigger clans get more and the smaller clans get less, but it is an assignment by lottery. And then in verse 55, we see, but if you do not dispossess the inhabitants of the land, those who you allow to remain will be stings in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they will harass you in the land in which you live, right? So I will do to you what I plan to do to them, right? So why are the Canaanites to be dispossessed? I don't know why this thing is sitting here. There. Why are the Canaanites to be dispossessed? Simply because if they remain, they will lead the people astray, and the people will be tempted to follow their gods. Not only do they have to be dispossessed, but if their cultic sites remain, then maybe the Israelites will go to those sites and worship those gods. There is a sense now that the people are going to make a transition. they're going to settle down. They're going to become agricultural people, farmers, right? And farmers are very dependent on rain and on the land and the Canaanite and the fertility of the land. And the Canaanite religion was in some ways a fertility cult. It also was about rain, right? And so there might be temptations once they're settled and once they're farmers, they might be tempted to worship other gods, and perhaps in addition to the God of Israel, right? The God of Israel is to be the exclusive God of the people of Israel. God is a jealous God. It is viewed in some sense as adultery to worship another God. And therefore, Therefore, all temptations to worship those other gods have to be removed. Okay, let me switch the view back and open it up if you have any questions or comments. Anything at all. And I don't see any, and not surprising perhaps, because this stuff is pretty straightforward. Yeah, so.
I'm not sure if I heard this. But to dispossess the Canaanites, did that mean to kill them? Or just to
See,
push them out of their land?
I would suggest to you, though we see that elsewhere, the verb here, dispossess, does not mean to kill, right? It means to exile, to send them out, right? And this represents a different approach, I think, to what we've seen before, which you know, the important thing is that they're not there. And here Moses is suggesting you can get rid of them. As long as you get rid of them and you destroy their cultic sites and their images and so on, then they won't be. And this is, by the way, where that expression comes from, a thorn in your side, right? Well-known English expression, which actually comes to us from the Bible. Sure. Anything else? Okay. So we're going to go back. Let me just go back in the view. All right. And we're going to come now to the boundaries of this land. And you can see these are various preparations that are being made. We're being reminded of the journey up to this point, and now we get the boundaries. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, instruct the Israelite people, say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as your portion, the land of Canaan with its various boundaries. And then it goes on to tell us where the boundaries are. The south will extend from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom. Southern border shall start on the east from the tip of the Dead Sea. Your boundary shall then turn and pass south to the ascent of Akrabim, continue to Zin, and so on. And it'll go south of Kadesh Barnea, and so on. And we get in the west, the Great Sea, Yam Hagadol, which is, or Gvul Yam, Yam Hagadol, the Great Sea, refers, of course, to the Mediterranean, which is the largest sea there. And we get the north, which, by the way, goes well up into Syria. And so we get the eastern boundary, and this is the land. So this land, as described, was never the land in which the Israelites lived, at least according to biblical text. Right? But interestingly enough, it is a land that the Egyptians, it was an Egyptian province known as Canaan at the time of the Exodus. Right? So these geographical boundaries are in fact well known, but they're described here in some idealized sense, probably known as Canaan because the Canaanites lived there, but they were under the control of the Egyptians, in the sphere of influence of the Egyptians. And one assumes that Canaan was some sort of vassal state.
Can you mute, Rabbi, can you mute everybody?
Yeah, I'm gonna mute everybody.
Stan. Thank you, though.
Yeah. Give me a second.
You see people going to the now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. Everybody should be muted at this point, and I'll open it up when we come back.
Everything else that we've done.
Okay, let me just put this down.
Enough of it, and people are, look.
Okay.
insulin And diabetes medication.
Well, I thought everybody was muted.
Stock sliding to their lowest so far this year as the inflation crisis continues to rock markets. And here's the percentage. change.
Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay. All right, hold on. Okay. So in a picture of what was the Egyptian province, and it does not include the land which is east of the Jordan. That is the land where the 2.5 tribes settle, but it is not part of the described land here, though it does go significantly north into Syria and a touch of Lebanon as well. Okay, and now we're told about the Levites. This is chapter 35. The Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho. And we've just heard about how the land is going to be apportioned. Well, actually, I did not go through that entirely, but I don't know that we need to. It's simply a list of the chiefs or the princes of each tribe, a list that we've seen again and again. Okay, so the Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes of Moab, saying, instruct the Israelite people to assign out of the holdings apportioned to them towns for the Levites to dwell in. You shall assign to the Levites pasture land around their towns. The towns will be theirs to dwell in. The pasture shall be there for their cattle, the cattle they own, and all their beasts. And then we get a description. The pasture that you are to assign to the Levites will extend 1,000 cubits outside the town wall. So remember that the tribe of Levi, which is the tribe from which the priests come, and remember the Levites were supposed to serve the priests in ritual matters, they get no land. They get no tribal land, but they have to be sustained, and they are essentially scattered among the people of Israel. There'll be cities of Levites in each of the tribal lands. I think there are a total of 48 of them all together, right? And so you have these religious functionaries, which are not off by themselves. They are there and available to the people, but they're not wholly dependent on the people because they do have land of their own and cities of their own. And then we get another description of it and of their holdings. And now in verse 6, the towns that you assign to the Levites will comprise the 6 cities of refuge that you are to designate for a manslayer to flee to which you will add 42 towns. So 6 cities of refuge, 42 towns. Thus, the total of the towns you will assign to the Levites shall be 48 towns with their pasture. In assigning towns from the holdings of Israel, take more from the larger groups, less from the smaller, so that each assigns towns to the Levites in proportion to the share that it receives. Now, we have these towns of refuge or cities of refuge, as they're called. The purpose of the city of refuge, we're going to see, is to protect someone guilty of manslaughter. They will be able to flee to the city and be protected from the Goel Hadam, the blood avenger, who was a member of the family of the person that they inadvertently killed. Right? And we're going to get a sense of really precise description of that, what distinguishes them. But first, let's just finish this. The Lord spoke to Moses further, speak to the Israelite people. When you cross the Jordan, you shall provide yourself with places you serve as a city of refuge, to which the manslaughter was killed, a person unintentionally may flee. The city shall serve as a refuge for the avenger, from the avenger, so that the manslayer may not die unless he has stood trial before the assembly. So what does this mean? It means if you inadvertently kill someone, where do you go? You either go to the city of refuge where there's a court, it's ambiguous, or you go first to a court who will adjudicate the case and determine whether you deliberately murdered someone or you accidentally murdered someone. So this is perhaps a step forward from a more ancient system, which was that if you killed someone, the blood avenger would kill you. It didn't matter why. You murdered someone, their relatives would come after you, and legitimately so. Right? We don't have police forces. We simply have this idea that the responsibility of avenging a death falls on the family. Now, when I say avenging, I don't want to quite put it in the terms that we might think. If you talk about avenging as being a form of revenge, then there is a sense that they're doing it for themselves. But actually, according to the Torah as a whole, when you murder someone or kill them, spill their blood, as it were, deliberately or not, the ground becomes polluted with their blood. And the blood needs to be redeemed. Right? Otherwise, the pollution remains. And in some sense, the land itself now, which is meant to be a holy land, is polluted. Go all the way back to the story of Cain and Abel. Right? Cain kills Abel, and God comes to Cain and says, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Abel says, "What? Am I my brother's keeper? Right? Am I supposed to watch him like a shepherd watches sheep? He's his own person." Denying really what happened. And God says to Cain, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Right? Your brother's blood demands that justice be served. It's polluting the ground. Okay, so this sense that there is this blood avenger who has not just revenge, it's a sacred duty to bring justice. In the book of Deuteronomy, we have this scene where a person dies between two towns, and it's not clear who killed them, right? And so the leaders of the towns, either the leader of the closest one, if it's clear what the closest one is, or the leaders of both towns, if it's in the middle, have to come out, and there's a whole ritual in which they state that our hands have not shed this blood, and all of that necessary, really, not because of revenge, but because the land has to be cleansed. Okay. So originally, one has the sense that it was simply up to the blood avenger, the Goel Hadam, but now we're setting up a society, and that process now is going to be limited. And it is limited to cases of homicide and not a situation where someone has committed manslaughter, inadvertently killing someone, and therefore we need some kind of judicial system. All right, and this is an innovation here in the Torah, which says, though it seems almost parenthetical, it's enormously important. He has to come in the language here. He has to come before the assembly, and clearly he can't come before the whole assembly because the land has been divided up. But it's a judicial process, and the evidence is going to be brought. And there need to be witnesses for a person to be convicted of deliberate murder. Okay, now we'll get a discussion of exactly what it is. And it's a rather elaborate discussion. You know what, I'm going to, well, I'll just read it quickly and then we'll come back to it next time. If so, anyone, however, who strikes another with an iron object so that death results is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. If he struck him with a stone tool that could cause death and the death results, he is a murderer, he must be put to death. Similar, if the object with which he struck him was wooden that could cause death, death resulted, he is a murderer, the murderer must be put to death. And so we have a succession starting with an iron object, and then a stone, and then something made out of wood. Iron objects generally are weapons. Stone is something that a person could just simply pick up, and then wood is probably some kind of tool which is being used. So what we're trying to do is encompass everything. Similar, okay, so then the blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. It is he who will put him to death. So we don't get judicial execution. He gets turned over and he's executed by a member of the family. Later on, this becomes a completely judicial process. And it is the Beit Din, the court who hears the evidence, who is responsible then for executing the person. So too, if he pushed him in hate or hurled something at him on purpose and death resulted, or if he struck him with his hand in enmity and death resulted, the assailant shall be put to death, he is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death upon encounter. So I want to say something before we look at the next little section, which we'll look at next time, about the death penalty in general in ancient Israel. So you're probably familiar what is called the lex talionis, which we see several times in the Bible, which is life for a life. How does it go? Life for a life, hand for a hand, and so on. In other words, if you kill someone, you're to be killed. If you cut off their arm, your arm should be cut off, and so on. It's clear that this was probably never practiced. The rabbis read it as financial compensation, and that makes a certain amount of sense. The Talmud itself says, how is this possible? What if a one-eyed man were to put out someone's eye? Would it be just that they'd be blinded, right? That you would put out their other eye? Clearly, that's not just. And if a person has only one hand, and now you're going to cut off their hands and so on, So it really was monetary compensation, with one exception, and that is capital punishment for murder. There can be no, according to this rule, you can't simply pay off the family. Right? Life, the loss of life demands the loss of life. Now, by the rabbinic period, the rabbis are really unhappy with this. And they, not in every case, but effectively really seem to limit capital punishment so far that it is not what we would call beyond a reasonable doubt. It's really beyond every doubt. And though, so that they say, well, there have to be witnesses. Not only do there have to be witnesses, but the person has to have been warned. That is to say, if you see someone who is about to kill someone, you have to say, are you aware that the Torah says that what you do now is a crime for which you will be executed? And they have to do it anyway. There have to be two witnesses. There's a variety of testimony, the different ways in which these witnesses are interrogated, and so on. And we get a statement in the Mishnah, this early level of the Talmud, that a court that executes someone once in 7 years, one capital case in 7 years, is considered to be a bloody Sanhedrin, a murderous court. And then we get another statement, no, once in 70 years. Right? If anyone were to be found guilty of a capital crime, once in 70 years, the court has blood on its hands. And we get this sense that it really shouldn't be at all. But we do get a counter opinion in the Mishnah, which is, if you take that approach, you are allowing and encouraging murder among the people of Israel. That is to say that it is a disincentive that the capital punishment is necessary, because without it, murder will become more common. So there's a kind of debate, but here in the Torah, we don't see that at all. The idea is there can be no monetary compensation, life for a life, not limb for a limb, which is money, but life for a life. Okay, I'm going to open it up. We're coming really to the very end. Any questions about any of this? Yeah, Saul, go ahead.
Yeah, I was looking in Devarim and Shoftim, and there it talks about 3 cities of refuge, not 6.
Yes.
Because this is after the Israelites conquered the land, I guess, right?
Right. There, the assumption, it's simply not talking. Here, we're focusing, and we've just read about it, right? Right in context, we've read about how these 2.5 tribes are permitted to settle on the other side of the Jordan. In Deuteronomy, we're simply not concerned with that. Deuteronomy is speaking specifically about within the borders of the land of Israel, and therefore we only need 3. Here, it mentions Transjordan, and we get 3 more. Any other questions about any of this, about these cities of refuge? I want to talk more next time about the cities of refuge. There's a whole section of the Talmud which deals with them, and also when this exile can end and when a person can return from the cities of refuge. And so we'll talk about all that next time, and then we'll come back to the daughters of Slafachad one more time, in a way which will limit their freedom considerably. And then we will have finished the book of Numbers. So we are going to finish next time. I'm going to give some thought to what else we will be studying. I'll be sending you the recording. And in addition, in that email, to which I'll attach the recording, I will also let you know what I plan to teach for the next few weeks before we look at the book of Ruth. In the meantime, I want to wish you all a great week. It's good to see you back. And hope to see you again next week. Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.